What is up, Twitter thugs, social media reprobates, and gamers of whatever platform? Welcome. I'm Fox, you're watching PlayStation News Now, your source of news, rumour, video game discussion, and our weekly The Gamer Couch podcast. You can follow the channel via Twitter, Fox at PlayStation News Now, as seen in the bottom right of your screen. Now, excuse the abundance of No Man's Sky background footage over the past few videos. It's just so damn mesmerizing and just looks so pretty in space. Anyway, in today's video, it is the question on everybody's lips: can Sony upgrade PlayStation Neo's specs? A theoretical piece by Richard Ledbetter at Digital Foundry, a veteran writer in the video game space. Now, I know Richard from as far back as when he wrote for UK magazine Mean Machines Sega back in the early 90s, so I know the guy knows his stuff. I'll be reading the article verbatim, which was submitted on the 14th of August via Eurogamer.net. The link is in this video's description. The date is set. On September 7th, we will see what Sony's been up to with PlayStation Neo. We should finally get some idea of the firm's vision for the new hardware, details on software support, and if we're really lucky, we should see live demos of Neo titles courtesy of Sony first-party studios, among others. But despite some pretty solid leaks, speculation continues on the actual Neo spec. Could Sony pull a surprise out of the bag and reveal a more powerful unit at the upcoming PlayStation meeting? For some time now, there has been some discussion about the technological makeup of Sony's new console. It kicked off with a NeoGAF thread, with insider info suggesting that the platform holder had been considering two different specs with a price differential, the more expensive offering a faster CPU and possibly a more capable graphics component. The speculation accelerated in the wake of Microsoft's Project Scorpio reveal at E3 this year. The new Xbox's 6 T-flop GPU is clearly more capable than the mooted 4.2 T-flop graphics core inside Neo. Could Sony pivot and respond by beefing up the specs on its machine? Looking back to PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, there is some precedent. Each in its own way received a pre-launch spec boost. Microsoft tinkered with the CPU and GPU clocks, increasing the former to 1.75 GHz and the latter to 853 MHz. Sony surprised many of us, including many disclosed developers, by revealing that PlayStation 4 would have more than 4 gigs of onboard GDDR5 initially spec'd. The big reveal on the night of February 21st, 2013 was a doubling of memory, effectively removing the key spec shortfall it had against Xbox One, or Project Durango as it was known back then. So what options are open to Sony here? The reality is that the options available are somewhat more limited than you may think. Microsoft's Xbox One clock speed boosts were possible owing to a number of factors. But first and foremost, there was the sheer size of the chassis, its relatively enormous cooling solution. Adding 9% to the CPU clocks and 7% to the GPU would not have troubled the thermal solution whatsoever. Conversely, assuming Neo follows PS4's design philosophy, we should expect a traditional console-like design with a similar cooling assembly. It's no secret PlayStation 4 already gets hotter and noisier than Xbox One. Upping clocks on what is likely to be a large processor may not be an option unless there's a new approach to the size of the machine and the internal cooler. Many of you will recall my mentioning PlayStation 4 Neo could have an external power supply, but note this is so far unsubstantiated. Now, we already know from the initial spec that Sony has had to be relatively conservative with its system clocks. The Polaris 10 GPU found in AMD's recent RX 470 and RX 480 graphics cards adjusts frequencies dynamically, switching between different power states. Via the Radeon Global Wattman application installed with the driver, we can see the processor clock versus power consumption curve. There are 7 power states in total, and the Neo spec rests at a relatively meager power state 2. If you can hear that, do excuse my cell phone's notifications alerts going crazy. I tweeted that I'm preparing another Neo video mid-recording, but I've muted the phone's volume now, so let's keep calm and carry on. So what's interesting about the power curve we see in the Wattman app is that it looks as though the best balance between power consumption and performance actually comes at power state 3. That's 1075 megahertz. If the cooling assembly can handle it, this is the most viable spec boost option available to Sony, representing a 17% increase in theoretical performance, moving the Neo GPU up to 5 teraflops. However, we have to put the emphasis on theoretical because the effectiveness of the additional compute resources tends to scale in line with memory bandwidth. Here, the Neo spec sits at 218 gigabits per second, not especially prolific, sitting next to the 320 gigabits bandwidth that Microsoft has allocated to Scorpio's 6 T-flop system. Now, upgrading this would require Sony to move to a premium priced 8 gigabytes per second GDDR5 as found in graphics cards such as RX 480 and GX 1070s. Such a move seems unlikely. Back in the day, Sony's big PS4 spec boost, the move from 4 GB of GDDR5 to 8 gigs in the final unit, was relatively easy to pull off. The firm managed to strike a deal with Samsung for its new 512 MB GDDR5 memory modules, double the density of existing DRAM, but totally compatible otherwise with the more standard 256 MB chips available at the time. No design alterations to PlayStation 4 were needed. It was literally a drop-in replacement of one set of DRAM modules for another. We understand that initial plans for PS4 concerned bundling the PlayStation camera as standard, and sources suggest that Sony financed the doubling of system RAM by removing the camera from the package, a highly astute move. With Neo there's theoretically, and I say theoretically for good reason, and I'll explain toward the tail end of the video, but with Neo there's less wiggle room in the basic design based on the leak spec, and only very limited gains in moving to more expensive modules. So what of the speculation concerning two competing Neo designs, one of which would have a more capable CPU and faster GPU with a $100 premium, and it's worth stating that no development sources Richard had spoken to have knowledge of this, and all of the documentation open to developers who are making Neo games now still report the same 2.1 GHz Jaguar CPU cluster paired with a 4.2 T-flop GPU. And it's also worth pointing out that AMD's semi-custom processor design work is not cheap. Creating two prospective designs would cost Sony a lot of money for very little return. As things stand, PlayStation Neo spec is pretty much the fastest console processor that AMD would have been able to make in time for a 2016 release. Polaris 10 is its most capable GPU, and AMD's Zen processor still isn't ready for market. Zen is such a radical departure from PlayStation 4's Jaguar core architecture that compatibility may be an issue there. A viable option would have been to produce a larger Neo chassis with a Meteor cooling assembly, which could in theory have allowed for the same processor to run at higher clock speeds. Power State 3's 1075 MHz would indeed have handed a faster 5 T-flop GPU, and maybe the AMD Jaguars could have been pushed further. In addition to a better thermal solution, maybe that extra $100 price premium could have financed faster RAM, with 8 GB per second modules taking us up to 256 gigabits of bandwidth. However, I suspect this is a moot point, a case of diminishing returns. Even if Sony pushes its new processor to the limits, the actual deliverable gameplay experience isn't going to be radically different. AMD's Radeon RX 470 is a cut-down version of the RX 480. Lower bandwidth, less compute, but the performance differential in terms of the gameplay experience is not hugely significant. And while the focus has been on Neo versus Scorpio T-flop differential, some of our recent testing has thrown up some interesting insights on the current gen console balance, particularly in terms of just how much of a bottleneck the Jaguar CPU cluster is. Xbox One S has a 7% GPU bump over the original hardware, and this has proved fascinating in that it allows us to isolate areas in gameplay that may well be CPU bound in nature. Fallout 4, Just Cause 3 hammer the 8-core Jaguar cluster, and both of them play identically between the two Xboxes, despite Xbox One S GPU bump. Galloping through Novigrad City in The Witcher 3, we see the same lurching dips below 30 frames per second on Xbox One S. A 2.1 GHz boost to CPU in Neo is obviously welcome, but clearly the 31% bump in performance isn't going to magically turn a 30 frame per second machine into a 60 frame per second one, but realistically that isn't likely without a whole new architecture in place. Now, the biggest obstacle to a Neo spec boost is rather more mundane in nature though: production timescales. A 2016 release date is looking likely, and we could even see Neo on shelves as soon as October, meaning that the console spec would have been nailed down many months ago. This is the reality of creating a mainstream consumer electronics device with a production run in its millions. The processor would have been in production for some time, and the memory module deal would have been completed many months ago, probably way ahead of the Scorpio spec reveal. And with Neo software submissions happening now, it would be pulling the rug from under developers to suddenly switch specs. On top of that, while Sony will still really have a disadvantage against Microsoft, it may well be out on the shelves up to a year earlier, and it should be cheaper too. Scorpio's 6 T-flop processor won't be inexpensive to produce, and that's not even factoring in the 12GB memory that Microsoft's mainboard render suggests it has. Now, of course, we'll all be happy to see a spec boost at the upcoming PlayStation meeting, and it's not beyond the realm of possibility, but the combination, all the factors discussed here, makes it seem unlikely. However, there is one potential theoretical win that Sony could provide that I think would be something of a crowd pleaser, and it comes back to the results we've seen from Xbox One S GPU spec boost. Fundamentally, Xbox One S's GPU bump is a proof of concept that demonstrates that additional graphics power can be deployed on existing games without breaking them. At the moment, Neo's base mode, which provides total compatibility with the older PS4, appears to default to the standard 1.0 GHz CPU and 800 MHz GPU clocks, presumably with downgraded memory bandwidth to match. What if the base mode was enhanced with the faster CPU and GPU resources, allowing with the new hardware? Developers would really be free to add in full Neo patches for enhanced features, but all other existing PlayStation 4 titles would stand to benefit with fewer drops from their target frame rates. It would be a welcome upgrade and an instant win that could help to shift a whole lot of boxes. And that's pretty much where the article ends. And really some great points here, but the only real issue I have with this article and pretty much any of the speculative, theorized articles that has surfaced around PlayStation 4 Neo is that, well, Sony have never confirmed official Neo specs. Look, here's the thing. 4.2 T-flops, slightly overclocked CPU, slightly faster, 8GB of GDDR5 RAM, allegedly leaked and still unofficial since Sony has yet to, well, really confirm any of this is still the case. A lot of people seem to think Sony doesn't have enough time prior to launch to improve PlayStation 4 Neo spec, assuming the quote-unquote leaked spec sheet is 2016 recent. In fact, as mentioned in my previous Neo video, I said the Neo spec leak that every game journo, writer or straight up clickbait merchant has referred to is well over a year old now, and quite candidly, even as old as 18 months. And let's face it, a lot could, and keyword here is could, have changed since early 2015. Hell, even the PlayStation 4 Neo Phase 2 12GB RAM development kits, that's the information I put out, is really around 4 months old now. Sure, we can all speculate 4.2 T-flops, 5.5 T-flops, 8GB, 12GB, 4K 30 frames, 60 frames per second, sure, go ahead, knock yourselves out. But ultimately, it's the games we'll all be playing that will matter the most. PlayStation 4 Neo isn't really going to outperform Xbox Scorpio. No, it's not going to outperform Xbox Scorpio, and it doesn't need to. The games Sony are able to create on a standard 1.8 T-flop PS4 are already incredible, so 6 T-flops is not really the be-all and end-all of anything. Now ask yourselves this: does it really matter which platform holder has the moderately higher spec console? Or does it matter more to you which platform holder has the type of games and diversity you want? It doesn't take a genius to figure it out. The people, and by people I mean, come on, the idiotic propaganda wannabe lapdogs to the corporations, shill YouTubers, yes. These people talk more about console, which console really has more T-flops, etc, etc, but what they're not talking a whole lot about is games. Now look, had the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 power situation been reversed in that PS4 had the 1.3 T-flops and Xbox One had 1.8 T-flops, well, it wouldn't have mattered one iota. People will still want the Uncharted's, The Last of Us sequel, Days Gone, God of War, Horizon Zero Dawn, the list goes on, and being the lesser powered hardware wouldn't have made a blind bit of difference in the grand scheme of things. PlayStation 4 gamers can take a little comfort in that, take a little comfort in that there will be an end to all this Neo speculation come September 7th. Not 9/11, that was a Freudian slip. And honestly, I think PlayStation 4 gamers deserve a little closure. And they will have it. Stay tuned. That brings us to the end of another video. If you enjoyed the content, go ahead and hit the like button. And thanks to all who kindly share our videos, helping us to reach more PlayStation fans and gamers in general. And of course, subscribe for more news, reviews, and always video game discussion. Until next time, play games, not corporations. Thanks for watching, everybody.